We could spend the next hour talking about all the failures of the pharmaceutical industry.
And I don't know whether that's true. And you don't know whether that's true either. And the problem is that because it has become so politicized, it's very hard to sift through what's true and what's not.
I have gotten dragged so many times on this fucking bird site.
The danger of these things happening are ginormous. I mean, for instance, one of my posts actually I just got a strike on Instagram because one of my posts I posted Robert Malone speaking.
When asked, do you think vaccines are safe? 50% of Americans said no.
You think that Omicron might be the end of the pandemic?
I believe so.
We can hold on to this for a second. What have you been teaching?
So I'm getting a PhD in economics at University of California, Santa Cruz. And one of the agreements as part of the package is you have to teach a class every quarter.
Is that normal for all PhDs, or is that because you're kind of later on in life?
It is field dependent, but certainly any program that is fully funded, meaning that you don't have to pay anything out of pocket, there's an expectation that you're either going to be doing. Yes, in fact, I think it's like one of the more misunderstood things about graduate programs is that maybe the majority of them, certainly if you discount masters, are fully funded. And if anyone's considering going to grad school, should certainly try to go for free.
I'm a big proponent in university being free in general.
Yeah, same. No, and I think that some of our biggest debt problems, student debt problems in the U.S. are people who are getting degrees that they're told are valuable that end up not being.
Brutal, huh? Well, it's good to see you in the flesh, man. It's always it's rough having interactions with somebody online. Sometimes rough when you just haven't. I don't think we've ever met.
No, I haven't had the pleasure.
And there's definitely been some friction, and
yes,
undoubtedly this is partially due to the topic that's been discussed. You fall really heavily on, and I hope you don't mind if I kind of do this podcast style. And yeah,
it's fine. Go right ahead.
More formal than I would usually if I was talking to you. Just telling you things you already know. Definitely partially because you've fallen very far on the other side of an argument that I've fallen on, and that's one of the most inflammatory topics that we've got going these days, and that's COVID. So I want to just preface this by saying, even though I vehemently disagree with a lot of positions that you've stated, and other people in the poker community, of course, have fallen on both sides, and there's a lot of back and forth. More than anything, it's the most important thing that we approach this with love and kindness and empathy. And even if one of us turns out to be completely delusional, which it seems like one of us is going to turn out, at least in this context, and probably not in the rest of life, it's important to treat people always with kindness and politeness and respect. And I think that that's the only way that we can really get to the root of these issues as a society, and we can set whatever example we can in whatever small way we can and whatever platform that we have, and send those ripples out into the world. So
totally. I just want to say I owe you a thank you, because we had exchanged some private messages, and I think that I needed to be calmed down, and you reminded me that it's important to have civility. And of course, it's always good to be reminded of the fact that when you disagree with someone, you're going to have infinitely more success, even if it's 1% versus 0%, leading with kindness and charitability. And it's something that I really strive for, but I think on this particular topic, I had really lost that. So I thank you for that. That was really, it was good to, and actually I heard it both from you and from my fiance. She was like, do you see how you're conducting yourself? And I was like, you're right. I need to be reminded.
That's such a good woman to have around.
Really, I'm really lucky. So yeah, the couple things I wanted to mention, respond to that you had just mentioned. So I think the subject is inflammatory, but I also think the medium. I mean, I think that social media just lends itself to these kind of antagonistic, combative arguments where I think um, if we approach disagreement, and this is always easier in theory than in practice, if we approach disagreement that we are both seeking the truth together, like this is a journey that we are both on, that's going to be so much better. But obviously, of course, it's it's very difficult to keep that in mind and to feel like you are unified with another person towards this common goal.
Yeah, especially when it's a public forum. I actually deleted my first Twitter account because the emotional damage that not damage, but emotional pressure I was feeling from somebody said something mean about me. Like I just saw a tweet just now that just came out randomly. I don't even follow the guy that was kind of like shitting on me. Now I feel discomfort and then I let it go. I know how to breathe through it. Before it used to really get to me. So I'm a lot better now at being able to handle myself with love and kindness, but obviously there's always room for improvement.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that you've probably encountered more haters, more hate than I will likely ever experience. And we are nothing compared to some of the celebrities. So I don't know how people deal with it. It's got to be extremely difficult to have that weighing on you on a regular basis.
Yeah, I think a lot of emotional disconnection happens.
Sure. And the last thing I wanted to respond to. So the idea that, and maybe this will be the segue into the discussion, but I think you suggested that maybe one of us is delusional. And I actually think in my experience of, having a dialogue, an in-person or on Zoom or on the phone dialogue with people that you disagree with, I think we'll find that we probably have more points of agreement than we may have previously thought. In fact, so I've done I think 3 of these before, debates, and I don't even know if I like the word debate because that's a loaded term in and of itself. But in these discussions, it almost seems like I agree with that. Oh, good point. Yeah. Oh yeah, I hadn't thought of that. And so that's what I'm hoping that we will, or that's what I'm anticipating that we will have, and I'm hoping that we have.
Yeah.
So
can I start with just to lay the foundation that of course you and I'm getting the feeling from you, and I didn't get this feeling from the last debate that I had, but I'm getting the feeling from you that you are in your own way truly dedicated towards doing good in the world, and you
absolutely.
You see COVID or the COVID phenomena and surrounding phenomena as a problem, and you want to solve it in the best way that you can to help the most amount of people that you can. And obviously neither of us have full political power to actually implement our policy. Right. So we're kind of just influencing in a small way, which lowers the stakes, luckily. But thank God not.
Yeah.
But it's I do appreciate that you and myself as well. We're both dedicated towards doing good in the world, and it's not as common as it ought to be, in my opinion. And whether if I turn out to be completely wrong on this, I hope you can appreciate that it was with good intention.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's always important to remind ourselves that everyone. I mean, I wish I could express this more eloquently, but everyone is doing the best that they can, and everyone means well. No one, I don't think there's a bunch of people who are trying to wreak havoc throughout the world. Everyone has, I don't know. I mean, this came up in the US and during Bush's term, where he talked about the axis of evil or the existence of evil people. And I just don't know if I believe that there are inherently evil people. I think there are people who have motivations that are different than our own.
I don't believe that anyone's evil or anyone's good. I believe I'm with the kind of Scholznitz idea that the line of good and evil falls between the hearts of all men, kind of thing. But I do know that people act evilly, and there are people that truly want to harm as many people in the world as they can, and that's what happens when somebody is so disenfranchised with the world and so disconnected from themselves that they suddenly see it as the opposite to how you and I might see it, and they want to harm as many people as they can. And then there's a spectrum between those two points. You have the fucking Dalai Lama on one end, and then you have the completely Hitler's on the other end, whomever you think might be the most evil.
Yeah.
And we all fall at different times in the day and different times in our lives throughout that spectrum. And I'm just always trying to attain as closer to this end as I possibly can. But obviously, our intentions always muddied by egos and things like that.
Sure, sure. But I think it is important to remember that people who are maybe on the other end of the spectrum, as you described it, have reasons for being there. You know, it was that they weren't loved as children, or like they've been left behind by, you know, their friends and family or governments, institutions, what have you. And so like oftentimes society bears responsibility for some of the people, you know, that are acting out.
Definitely.
I know it's a huge problem in the US. Like I think that we're probably not doing a good enough job of preventing some of people slipping through the cracks. Like, I mean, drug overdoses are massively up in the US, and like that's just a policy failure. I mean, that's not, you know, that's not the US hasn't run bad. It's a policy failure.
Yeah, and maybe it's also, and this could probably segue into some COVID talk. Maybe there's also a spiritual failure of the people who are, you know, society's kind of tilted, so the more corrupt people are people in positions of power, and people that are more incentivized by money instead of by human well-being often tend to be in the positions of creating policy or manufacturing, let's say, for instance, opioids that are distributed to millions of people throughout the USA. And this, I'd be curious to perhaps dive into that and say, pre-2020 and post-2020, what have your positions been on the idea that there are truly corrupt people and then conglomerations that enact terrible monstrosities across the globe? But let's specifically look at pharmaceutical companies in the USA.
I wouldn't say that like any of those positions of mine have evolved or changed. Like, but you know, if we're using 2020 as a marker, I think pre and post are roughly similar. I would say that I have a normal amount of cynicism regarding, you know, the role of corporations or corrupt individuals. You know, I think that you know, there's the joke about what is it about democracy, how it's oh geez, something about it's like the worst form of government, but it's better than all the others, or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how I feel about like the status quo of a lot of things. And with regard to pharmaceuticals, we could spend the next hour talking about all of the failures of the pharmaceutical industry. You know, from opiates, which is probably the most recent example, to the fact that there's money in selling cures rather than prevention. I think that they have been derelict in their, you know, advice on nutrition. You can't. There's no money to be made selling good nutrition, or sunlight or activity. I mean, these are all things like, unfortunately, I mean, not humans. I mean, humans are, but Americans are, I feel like, the worst offenders, are getting sicker and sicker. And that is despite the fact that we have more knowledge than we've ever had and more wealth than we've ever had. And yet we're shooting ourselves in the foot. It's an own goal of epic proportions. And so I think the pharmaceutical companies, I don't know how much blame they deserve for that. I mean, you could argue that, you know, Americans largely should be taking control of their own health, you know, and not letting some of these things get out of hand, you know, like obesity and blood sugar issues and, you know, causes of cancer that we can manage. So I guess I would say that, like, I just don't know if I share the same level of cynicism that you do about the role of these institutions in creating, you know, the state that we're in today. I think that I think they have the potential to be hugely beneficial, and I think on the subject of like vaccines, they're hugely beneficial. But I do think that the creation of a bunch of drugs to treat conditions that we can treat ourselves is rather unfortunate. I think like diabetes is something I know a lot about, and it's the most prevalent disease, and I believe it's the most prevalent disease in the U.S. Nearly 40 million Americans. Over
Holy
10% of the
shit.
over 10% of the population in the U.S. has diabetes, and this is incredibly treatable. If you're type 2, this is something you can take care of on your own, and yet people are paying gobs for drugs and insulin, and yeah, it's just a massive fuck up.
Yeah. So just to speak on the corruption of the conglomerations and the corporations, there are public records of many billions of dollars having to be paid out in trials. Sorry, not in trials, in court settlements and in fines from pharmaceutical companies, and these are all of the big names involved. Not only providing damaging products, but hiding data, cherry picking data, hiding side effects, and false advertising their products for the sake of profits. It's very well known to the public, at least if you know where to look. And there's a list of all of the biggest lawsuits that's ever happened in litigation. They're all just by the pharmaceutical companies. Like Pfizer had to pay out something like $2 billion for just one of these lawsuits, and it isn't just incompetence. It is there are people who they're hiding side effects. They're lying about what's happening. And Vioxx, for instance, I think caused the death of tens of thousands of people completely unnecessarily, because side effects were hidden. And I'm on the same team as you in the sense of I believe that institutions and corporations have to exist. And, if we completely desolate them, then we're going to be left with chaos. But what's happened over time is that successful people have become corrupt, or corrupt people have become successful, whichever way you think it might have happened. And I'm not cynical. I just see what's happening in front of me, and I say, I do not trust these pharmaceutical companies to be telling the truth with their data, especially when there's such little transparency happening behind the scenes. And I know that this is, for many millions of people across the world, one of the core reasons where they're choosing not to take the mRNA jabs or the other jabs that are COVID related, because Pfizer is literally hiding data. There are literal whistleblowers happening across, I don't know if it's across the world, but across the internet, coming out and saying this is an evil corporation. They were hiding this from the trial. There are tons of scientists coming out and saying this isn't okay. Why is this happening? There are tons of lawyers saying we need to have the published raw data now. And then Pfizer and the FDA just completely, I think it's the FDA, it might be the CDC, sorry, are saying actually no, we don't want to be publishing these data now. And that to me is a serious question mark. Now that alone isn't like the full argument of why not to take these jabs, and we can get into other things too, but
sure.
Where do we agree and where do we disagree on this?
Yeah, no, I think that's a reasonable starting point. So I think you said something I was going to say, which is like, unfortunately, like I think this is the way that things kind of have to be. I think that you will not find too many industries that are beloved, especially at the macro scale. You take a company like Amazon or Walmart that is making people's lives materially better at a massive scale, and yet people are always bitch. I don't know about in the UK, but in the US, they're always complaining about the treatment of workers, which I totally appreciate. I mean, when I was in school, the concern was sweatshops, and I thought, oh yes, this is a cause I really want to get behind this. And it wasn't until I discovered economics that I realized that sweatshops are like some of the best jobs in the developing world. If you're working at a clothing factory in Bangladesh, you are probably earning more than any of your peers. So it's complicated. Everything is more complicated than it appears at its face or on its face. And so I am not going to defend the behaviors of Pfizer in all cases. I think that we all have to do cost benefit calculations. And I mean, that's part of the reason like economics is called the dismal science, is because like there's some hard trade-offs that are really unpleasant from time to time. I know, like in the UK with socialized medicine, they figured out like there's an amount that they're willing to spend to keep someone alive for an additional year at the end of life. That had to be done because you have scarce resources and you have a nationalized healthcare system. In the US, we have similar problems with, you know, how much are insurance companies willing to pay to keep you alive? You know, should we spend $5 million to get you from 89 to 90 when you're in ill health? And so these are unpleasant conversations. So with regard to Pfizer, they are, anytime there's an opportunity to make a drug that they believe is going to have benefits, you know, they are plunging money into R&D, and they're not going to have a 100% success rate. And I think it's awful, awful, awful when a drug that they produce is killing large numbers of people. But I do wonder if that's something that is bound to happen regardless of how good the science is, how good the company is. I think it's just the nature.
Just to kind of catch you there, the trials have shown that they were intentionally hiding side effects, and now that isn't something that has to happen within society.
So maybe we should establish right now that, unfortunately, like, this is something I can't fact check this stuff on the fly.
It's publicly available.
Yeah. No, I'm Charlie. What I'm saying is, like, we can't, like, I could say like, oh, what about this research paper? And you'd be like, well, I haven't read that yet. I'll be like, well, it says this, and I would imagine there's going to be dozens of things like that. And like, this is the issue I've had with Alex and Kristen, is that I'm always being assigned to read something from a whistleblower, some research paper, some usually not peer-reviewed research paper, and it can, you know, that can go on forever and ever. But regarding the studies, I only know the efficacy that was determined by the studies. I don't know much about the side effects.
So just before we get lost in something else that we weren't speaking about, just to maybe trying to tailor off on this part of the conversation. I mean, I know that this bet isn't going to happen, but if you would like, I would be willing to bet as much money as you want that these phenomena are real, and that I've researched this, and I've learned this, and I've read about it, and I've listened to experts speak about it, not people who are anti-vax crazy conspiracy theorists, people that are very pro-pharmaceutical and even pro these vaccines, speaking very, very in a lot of depth about how these pharmaceutical companies have done cruel and terrible things for the sake of profits. And it's very, this knowledge is very publicly available. So given that supposition is true, from my perspective, what when I'm looking at new pharmaceuticals rolling out, knowing that they're willing to bend data, they're willing to lie, they're willing to cherry pick and gerrymander all of these different things, and the institutions that are guarding the chicken coop are actually very interwoven with the companies that are creating them. It's like the fox guarding the chicken coop kind of situation. Then suddenly there's this lack of trust and this lack of transparency in these data that are crucial to understanding a personal risk-benefit analysis. And that is something that I think is at the heart of this, that we need to understand, is that if we can't trust these companies, which they've proven time and time and time again that we can't, how are we meant to trust these data and these data analyses by these regulatory bodies in the first place? And yes, there's other arguments for why you might be able to trust vaccines, and we can get into that. But just as a core point at the beginning of the 2021 vaccine rollout in January, surely there's got to be some skepticism as a society to say, if they've been proven to be so distrustworthy, how can we take their word that these vaccines are, well, it turns out that they weren't as effective as they told us they were going to be, and people can actually get affected with COVID, but how can we trust that they're even as safe as they say they're going to be?
Okay, so yeah, now we're really getting into the crux of the matter. So I think it's fine for you to have a strong prior that pharmaceutical companies should not be trusted. I think that is a reasonable point of view to hold. I think, though, if you are like a good Bayesian and you update in the face of new information, that the longer amount of time that we have these vaccines, and we'll just talk about like the major ones in the US,
yeah,
the longer amount of time that we have these, and the greater the number of people who are vaccinated increases, as that number increases, we become more confident about the safety of them. And I totally sympathize with the person who, in January 1st, 2021, was vaccine hesitant. So like my dissertation and my what's called job market paper was on COVID vaccination lotteries, which were this dystopian thing that existed in the U.S. In which people were offered entry to a lottery for getting vaccinated as a way of boosting vaccine uptake.
Sorry, that's ambiguous. Do you mean that they were, if they win, they get vaccinated, or if they win the lottery, they get
No. If they get vaccinated, they are given free entry into a lottery. This was rolled out in one state and ended up being adopted by 19 more states. And so, yeah. However, if you believe that vaccines are effective, paying people to get them is like a reasonable proposition. And in fact, a lottery is like the best way to do it because people don't understand expected value. They're going to massively overvalue the value of their lottery ticket. And there's some evidence to support the fact that exactly the people who are going to downplay their risks of getting COVID or downplay their risk of bad reaction to COVID, there's the exact people who are going to exaggerate their EV at the lottery. So I actually think it was like a smart program. But one of the things that I had to understand before doing this was understanding vaccine hesitancy. And vaccine hesitancy is extremely high throughout the Western world, much less in the developing world.
But before we get into this, can I just comment on the first point that you made?
Yeah. Please go ahead.
As you quite correctly stated, and as I was going to state as well, if you can say from a Bayesian perspective, I have been updating my priors the whole time, and I really try to be quite stoic about that and not be too attached to my kind of anti-establishment kind of ideologies or anything like that, because whatever. Sometimes they're going to create things that are good, sometimes they're going to create things that are bad. And you're right. We've seen billions of people roll this, take these, or I don't know how many hundreds of millions of people have taken these vaccines. And if these vaccines were even causing 1% death or 0.1% death, then we would know by now, which has completely eradicated many of the conspiracy theories that were floating around about how deadly these vaccines were going to be. Which, by the way, at the beginning of the vaccine rollout, I actually suggested that I thought these vaccines were going to be safe, even though I wasn't going to take one myself. Mm-hmm. So I believe that it's important to be able to keep updating your kind of Bayesian analyses, if you want to say it like that, or your risk benefit analyses. And I believe that we have to be factual about that, and that the people were very wrong. There are a number of people on both sides of the argument that have been extraordinarily wrong this whole pandemic, and just not admitting it whatsoever. But so one of the issues that I see with this hypothesis is that we don't have these long-term safety data that are usually required for at least 10 plus years for these mRNA vaccines. So we have an incomplete data set, meaning that if I'm trying to personally create a risk benefit analysis for myself, and just to be clear, I'm not going to tell other people not to take these vaccines. I've not been one of those people that's like, never take it. Maybe in a personal setting or one-on-one, I'll share my opinion because I think that's more apt. Because they'll know not to just take my word as gospel, and I'll know that they won't take my word as gospel. But when I'm completing this risk benefit analysis, I need a complete data set. Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty. And so far, because of the lack of long-term safety data with a very new technology that's only been around for maximum 20 to 30 years, it's difficult. It's difficult to say, I'm going to trust this new thing inside of my body for a disease that, I couldn't die from it if I tried. I got COVID twice. I barely noticed it. And obviously there's other arguments for like not spreading it to other people and things like that. But my personal risk benefit analysis for not taking these vaccines, apart from also having some kind of background issues around reactions to medications that are genuinely potential worries, they are I believe that I'm creating a good and rational risk benefit analysis for myself. And I don't care what other people do, in the sense of like, I would die for your right to take these vaccines I actually don't believe they're vaccines, but these jabs, if you should so choose to. I would fight on that hill, and you'll see me in the Twitter comments. If they ever try and take away your vaccines, I'm with you, man. But at the same time, I would hope that other people would fight, perhaps not to the same vehement extent that I would fight, but at least to some extent, for my right to choose not to. And this is why we've created things like the Nuremberg Code, for instance, because coercion and force is not okay when it comes to bodily autonomy. And that's what we discovered after Nazi Germany, and that's what we've withheld until 2021.
Yeah, I guess I would. There's a lot to respond to there.
I went off on a
You're
few
fine.
times.
You're fine. It's totally okay. You've been great so far. So I think that I appreciate the incomplete data. I think this is unfortunately, once again, the lesser of two bad outcomes is to roll with the technology that is unproven or untested, sufficiently proven or tested. And alternatively, we don't know the long-term effects of contracting COVID. I was trying to dig into long COVID within the last couple of days, because I hear it mentioned all the time, and I haven't seen like a really good analysis of it. Like what's
it's rough. It's rough.
Sure. So okay. So we're talking about a long-term effect that is brutal for some small percentage of the population. I don't want to like diminish how many people have suffered from it, but it sounds really awful. I wonder if it is much larger than the group of people who are suffering long-term side effects from the vaccine. And this is, I mean, maybe this is as good a time as any to segue into like the VAERS, which is usually brought up in this conversation. This is the vaccine adverse event reporting system that exists in the US, although I think they also take data from outside the US. Trying to go through this data set is just an absolute nightmare, because anyone can report any adverse reaction. I've gone through this data. I had suspicions that it was magnifying the risks that were associated with the vaccine. And the things that I quickly learned, because I won't, I tried to get one of the more petty things I did was I tried to get Kristen to download this data set, because I thought for sure once she saw it, she would understand what I understood.
I think I have it downloaded on my computer, by the way. I've looked through it as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a bit off topic, but it's amazing what people consider research these days. People are always saying, do your own research, but like, I don't know what research means to the layperson who hasn't done science, who hasn't done, data analysis. But I heard this VAERS data set talked about all the time, so I downloaded it. And what I quickly found out two things. One is that there is an incredible number of extremely old people who died some amount of time after getting the vaccine.
Yeah.
Now, again, from like a Bayesian point of view, someone gets the vaccine and they die, you think, okay, the vaccine could have caused their death. However, when that person is 95 and they get a vaccine, I mean, their unconditional chance of dying in the next few months is actually quite high.
Yeah, of course.
And so when you're looking through it, like the average age of people who die after getting the vaccine is, I don't have the exact number in front. I'm certain it's north of 85. Okay, so that was my first concern, is that people talk about death from the vaccine. It's all elderly people.
Maybe median is north of 85, but considering that there have been a number of children, I imagine the mean is going to be a lot lower.
I don't think there are a lot of children who have died from it, but actually, you're right. Like, if we took a random sample of people who had died for all causes, I suspect it might actually be bimodal. Like, I think that there's a high rate of like infant mortality. This is, again, unfortunately, like a US problem. I believe like infant mortality is higher in the US than it is in most of the Western world. And then it would be like really high on the other end of the spectrum. I mean, I could check this, after we're done talking, but I do think that both mean and median are going to be extremely high. The other thing I realized is that because it's a system where anyone can report anything, there are a lot of people who are posting things that are completely unrelated to a COVID vaccination. I mean, stuff that could never be. There's a joke. Cardi B tweeted that someone got an STD from the vaccine.
And so their balls enlarged or something like that.
Pardon?
I think she said that their testicles.
Oh yeah. That's what it was. I'm glad you remember. So there's the noise, what you would call noise. When you're looking for signal in a data set, there's a lot of noise there, and it's difficult to kind of parse the symptoms. And that is one of the things that like the CDC is paid to do, is to go through this and to check stuff, and they're updating it. And so one thing that I would say to people who are like saying, oh, there's an alarming number of deaths or adverse reactions from vaccines compared to previous years have had high reports that have had to be gone through and edited to get to the true number of deaths or adverse events. This will happen with this data set as well. However, one of the major problems with this data set in 2022 is that the vaccine has become so politicized that this has almost become weaponized, and that especially, and I would say the vaccine has gotten political in the US probably, there started to be a divergence in maybe late spring, early summer, in which the best predictor of whether or not you got the vaccine was the level of Trump support in your county, which is so sad that your political affiliation predicts whether or not you're going to get the vaccine. But putting that aside, the VAERS started to turn up more and more questionable reports. And so I'm worried about the only data set that we have to determine the safety of the vaccine has been corrupted, not by corrupt individuals, but I think by people who are seeing this as an opportunity to score political points, which is unfortunate, because ultimately we care about this.
Dive in there. The reason, and again, I actually don't want to spend too much time talking about the vaccine efficacy and safety and things like that, because I don't wish to convince anybody of my opinion, because my opinion is less valuable than many other people's opinions. So why would anyone listen to me about whether to take this vaccine or not? But just to rebut that little part, there have been multiple independent analyses on whether the VAERS report is underreported or overreported, and multiple independent entities have concluded that it's underreported by quite a significant margin. And you can do this by taking a data set from somewhere very isolated, say like an insurance company, or say a corporation that hires hundreds of thousands of people, look at their adverse events post-vaccine, and then gauge how much of that is likely to be background noise by putting it versus expected diseases and things like that. And these independent analyses have come often that they're 4 to 5 times roughly underreported. And I don't know whether that's true, and you don't know whether that's true either. And the problem is that because it has become so politicized, it's very hard to sift through what's true and what's not. And you'll have one part of the internet, you'll have one side of Twitter, and I'll have another side of, I try to be in both, but it's, it's hard. It's hard because it knows what I want to click on. It knows I want to see what stuff that I agree with, bastards.
It is hard.
But it is, again, it's a very incomplete data set with a lot of very intelligent scientists, very prominent scientists who are putting their necks on the line to say, we don't think that these vaccines should be taken by this demographic of people, whether it's previously infected people, whether it's children. For instance, just those 2 categories alone, there's a group of something like 16 to 17,000 scientists and relevant scientists and medical professionals and MDs that are saying behind it, it's called the Unity Project, that vaccines ought not to be mandated for those 2 specific groups, because they don't believe it's a positive thing for these groups to be vaccinated. Now, again, I don't care to speak about whether that's true or not. You and I aren't going to get to the bottom of that today. But what I care about is that we do not mandate these vaccines or these treatments. I don't actually believe it's vaccines, these treatments for people, because there is so much uncertainty. And what if you're wrong? What if you're wrong? What if we forced people and their kids are going to die, or in 10 years time, they're going to have like seemingly unrelated sicknesses that have manifested from these mRNA shots or whatever they're taking? What if that happened and we forced people or coerced them or segregated them out of society because they weren't willing to participate in something that doesn't have long-term safety data? And I really don't care to speak about whether the vaccines are good or not, because who knows? But what I care about is that we do not force people against their own will, and we don't coerce people. And we don't do what some people in the poker industry have suggested of taking a two-tier society, which history tells us is probably not a good idea. But please to respond to whatever you feel like responding there.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate the precautionary principle. Like, when we're uncertain about the outcomes, that we should choose the safer route. However, I think it's at least up for debate whether or not abstention from taking the vaccine is the safer route. I think that a point of agreement we would have is I don't think vaccine mandates are appropriate. I think there are alternatives to that. I do think, though, that because of the externalities of a transmissible disease, that a case could be made that you do impose costs on the people around you. And so for that reason, having restrictions or making life a little uncomfortable for people who are choosing not to be vaccinated, I think is reasonable. However, I think when there are cases, as you mentioned, like young children where the cost benefit is much closer, like the 16-year-old kid on choosing whether or not to get vaccinated is like weighing two minuscule risks. I mean, incredibly small risks, as opposed to, I think everyone over the age of 40, it's a slam dunk unless you have some crazy adverse reactions to vaccines from previous vaccines.
Okay, so just to jump in on that. Again, I don't want to speak about how efficacious and safe these vaccines are. Neither you nor I know this. But
it is wrapped up in the subject of whether or not you think that they should be required, because what's implied is that you worry about future outcomes for people who are vaccinated. So you are speculating that there is a chance, a non-trivial one, that there could be adverse outcomes 10 years down the road.
I'm not speculating. I'm saying there definitely could be a chance. And because of that, we can't enact these psychopathic policies that will sweep people left, right, and center with no individualization, with no nuance, to just say, these demographic of people that have conducted this risk-benefit analysis have to stay outside of society, or they have to take this vaccine, or whatever the policy is. And these people that they've chosen that the risk-benefit analysis is worth it for them, they're allowed back into society. It is a psychopathic policy, and I'm not calling you a psychopath or anything like that, but it's,
no, I understand.
When you create policies, it's like people saying, for instance, that you should, if you're triaging, if you're in a medical, in an ICU, and saying that vaccinated people should be served way before any unvaccinated people. They should always have priority. It's such a psychopathic policy. It cuts it down the line black and white, whereas triage is meant to be this intuitive multivariate analysis based on who needs it more. You could start banning people for smoking. You could start banning people for whatever they do to their body that's damaging, but that's not how medicine works. If somebody decides that they want to smoke, we let them smoke. If somebody decides they want to eat McDonald's, we let them eat McDonald's. And perhaps that's going to be causing, in fact, that is going to be causing damage to larger society, because they're going to be less proactive. They're going to be lazier. They're going to have higher fucking viral loads within their body because they're obese. But we still allow them to do it because that's the point in a free society. And if we create these policies that are black and white without nuance, we sweep people into these two categories. We create a two-tier society that we cannot recover from, because it's divided the population into two, and it's going to be causing harms that we just can't even fathom. And again, I don't want to talk about too much whether or not, because you know my position on the vaccine efficacy. I know your position. I don't care about it. I care about not letting the government and not letting bureaucrats and not letting corrupt politicians create these vast, sweeping, psychopathic policies for the populace.
Well, I mean, with regard to triage, like we actually do treat patients differently, you know, on whether or not they're obese or whether or not they smoke. I mean, for example, organ transplants. We have a very, you know, we have a finite number of organs that can be donated to people. You have to meet certain criteria to receive organs. I mean, there was famously in the news, you know, someone who was refusing the vaccine who was not able to receive an organ transplant. But similar things have been done for obese people, and we don't give lungs, we don't give new lungs to smokers. So there are examples in the face of scarce resources of making these determinations. Now,
the difference is there that the people who are not taking these vaccines are deciding not to do something to their body. The people who are drinking and smoking are deciding to do something to their body. So as soon as we start coercing people, then you're crossing that sacred boundary that that society should never cross, which is bodily autonomy.
So I think that another crux that we have here is that you believe that the decision to take the vaccine is solely a decision of maximizing one's own utility, and I think that I don't think that. So you recognize there's externalities to the disease, and that there's like society potentially benefits from an additional person being vaccinated.
I would be probably sub 90 IQ to have to not recognize that.
Okay. So we both recognize that there is a cost imposed to society when a person chooses not to get vaccinated. There's a benefit incurred by society when someone chooses to get vaccinated. Okay. And then I guess the philosophical debate is whether or not the cost to society is large enough that society can say to an individual, hey, we would like you to get vaccinated, and if you don't, you know, you will not have access to these particular locations. Is that fair? Am I framing the argument correctly?
Yeah, that's the argument for sure.
Okay. So then the question becomes, okay, what are reasonable things that we can ask of people who are unvaccinated, and what are unreasonable things? And I think that one of the things that's difficult about being in the US is that I am not privy to like what life is like in Canada or the UK or Germany. I mean, pretty much every country, as I understand it, outside of the US in the West has more strict guidelines, you know, for those who have chosen not to get the vaccine. Like life is pretty easy if you haven't gotten the vaccine in the US.
It's pretty easy in most of Europe as well. There are a few countries kind of like heading the march towards totalitarianism, like Austria and Germany, but yeah, England, the restrictions are completely gone for everyone.
So is your fear largely anticipatory?
I mean, partially. It depends what kind of, I mean, it's not really fear, but what kind of concerns that you're talking about.
Okay, I guess maybe we should, it's a good time to get to specifics. Maybe we should have done this before. What policies specifically are you most concerned about?
So let's start off in the deep end. I'm currently speaking to somebody on Twitter who's living inside China. I just asked him to do a podcast because he's sharing a lot of information about what's happening in China right now in regards to the COVID response. Mm-hmm. There are, according to him, millions of people currently living inside quarantine camps, locked in, and that's just inside quarantine camps, millions of people locked inside their own cities and being taken away from their bedrooms at night against their will to be thrown inside these quarantine camps. In Austria, what's happening is that now it's...
Can I just interrupt you real quick? I will never defend anything that the authoritarian regime in China does. Like, I actually think that China is one of the worst human rights violators, and it is unfortunate that we are turning a blind eye to a lot of their stuff because of their, you know, status as a trading partner. So I will never defend anything that China is doing.
Thank you.
Just to be clear.
Yeah, no, it's good. Thank you for saying that, because actually I spoke to Destiny quite recently and he was unwilling to say anything like that, which, well, in Austria, what's happening, it's now become illegal to be unvaccinated, meaning that you will be fined, and if you can't pay the fine, you'll go to jail. Now that firstly means that only rich people can stay outside and be unvaccinated without having to go to jail. And it secondly means that they've created a two-tier society.
Yeah.
And that is where a lot of the Western world seems to be marching. For instance, Canada, although it's looking like their freedom convoy is doing some good. The UK was looking very, very dangerous. Like, these debates were floating around in political circles very strongly. But we had a lot of protests, and these mandates have been reversed. And throughout the world, unanimously, for some whatever reason, fascists and totalitarians stood up and said, this is the time to seize power. Now, you can hypothesize about why that happened, or about who's behind it or who's not behind it, or whatever kind of conspiracy rabbit hole you want to go down. But the fact is that fascists love fascism. Totalitarians love totalitarianism. And we've been seeing it left, right, and center, north, south, east, and west. And this isn't just some kind of like, oh, I hope this doesn't happen. We were seeing it happen in front of our eyes, and millions of people across the world were standing up and saying, this is not okay. And I'm on their team. It is not okay.
Yeah, I don't want to see vaccine mandates. I think as far as I'm willing to go is, I think I want life to be a little inconvenient for someone choosing not to get the vaccine, because ultimately, I mean, unfortunately, throughout the West, there is a resistance to vaccines. I know that in California, we had a measles outbreak in the early 2000s because there was a push. And anti-vax used to be like a very left-wing position, but there was a push to not vaccinate children. And, you know, the success of the measles vaccine requires herd immunity, and we fell below that. And of course, as soon as we fall below that, there's an outbreak, and people started to see the value of vaccines. And sure enough, California's vaccine rate for children has shot up once again. But yeah, so I think as far as I'm willing to go is to make life a little inconvenient. But I do think that there should be alternatives. So I think that one of the things I was willing to grant people who were opposed to the World Series policy on vaccine is, I think proof of prior infection should have been substitutable with the vaccine. I think that's a really reasonable thing to do. I think at that time, and this is always evolving, but like, I think natural immunity was considered to be superior to the immunity conferred from the vaccine.
Yeah, by
yeah, I think that is less true now. I think that that's started to change with Delta, but I definitely don't want to.
Maybe in terms of mortality, because do you mean with Omicron or Delta?
With Omicron. So like the number of people that got COVID twice, I think, is a function of Omicron not being the immunity from previous infection not being applicable to Omicron, whereas it appears that the mRNA vaccine might have been more effective towards preventing Omicron. However, I want to grant that natural immunity, I think, was superior to the vaccine prior. However, I don't think people should have like tried to get infected to get this beautiful natural immunity. I think it just happened to be the case that people who made it through infection were protected, at least temporarily.
So just to run back to what you were saying about the mandates and you being against the mandates, how many times have you said that online and said, hey guys, just so you know, I'm pro-vaccine, but these mandates are not okay, and here's why?
I would have to check. I'm probably guilty of like not being vocal enough about that. I think it's because, to me, the thing that was more important was to get the number of vaccine recipients up, because, like, listen, how we feel about these topics is probably greatly framed by the countries that we live in. So like in the US is a profoundly stupid country that is making mistakes left and right. It's a political disaster lately, policy disasters left and right. And we have this distinction of being the country in the West that has the most deaths per capita from COVID by a large margin. And we're the country that had the vaccine first. We have all of the advantages in the world. We saw China get COVID first. So we could have responded to that. We didn't. Our president minimized the extent of the risks involved. We had the vaccine first, and we blew that. And so it's my primary concern has been to try to increase vaccine uptake. Although at this point, I don't know how anyone could be swayed. I think anyone who's chosen not to get the vaccine, I don't see them ever changing their mind. But I do think because of that, I want to implement as many nudges as possible. And so like an effective nudge, unfortunately, in the US was to require vaccine, was for employers to require vaccines. And, that seemed to get a lot of people who were on the fence off of the fence. However, I think perhaps an alternative to that should be that you have to just submit to, tons of testing, or that if you miss work because of COVID, that you will receive, you won't receive pay or something like that.
Okay, so just to jump in, so we can kind of address kind of at least a couple of things at a time, maybe three maximum. You've stated, obviously, that you're very, very pro-vaccine. I feel that and I respect it. You've stated that you're anti-mandate, but you've only communicated one of those things online. Now, this has been...
Well, we don't know. I mean, unless you've done research, like I'm saying that I'm conceding that I possibly was not loud enough about it, but I know that I've expressed concerns. Like I can think of a conversation I had publicly with Liv, because Liv, I think has come out recently in the last month or two. I think it's only been within the last month or two, as someone who's increasingly concerned by the level of authoritarianism in some countries. And so I think that has also, nudged me into looking into this a little bit more and seeing which policies I think are too extreme. And so the US has not implemented.
Do you see the disparity here? If we're talking about the level of authoritarianism that we're seeing within China or we're seeing within Austria, the danger of these things happening are ginormous. They're much larger than the danger.
I'm not worried.
Even if everybody in the world was unvaccinated and caught COVID twice over, because the vast majority of people can almost barely, like they couldn't die from COVID if they tried. The vast majority of people. And I'm not suggesting that people dying from COVID isn't a terrible thing. I understand the despair that probably comes with watching a family member or a loved one die because they can't breathe like that. I'm not trying to diminish that. But we're walking towards what looked to be at one point, and it potentially could, a globalized authoritarianism on an unprecedented scale. And I think that it seems really tribal and illogical and irrational to say, I'm going to speak for this pro-vaccine, I'm pro whatever this side of this tribe says, but I have these opinions, but I'm not going to speak about them online. And that to me, and I've seen it not just with you, I've seen it with so many people. Like I had a conversation with somebody that was being quite, is harassing me online, honestly, and he was a friend, at least somebody that I knew through the high stakes community. And I had a call with him like this, but it wasn't recorded. And we got to the bottom of it, and I asked, and I found out that he was against masking children. He was against mandates. He was against all of these different things. And I was like, so how many of these have you spoken out against? And he said, well, none of them. But he'd spoken out against all of the pro things. And we got to the core issue of why. And it's because he was scared. He was scared of the social reaction. He said this. And this is a huge problem. There is a silent proportion of the population that is extraordinarily worried about what's happening across the world in terms of the totalitarian marches, that are completely terrified, scared, witless to speak out against it because people, and it is people like you, and again, much love to you, brother. I'm not judging you as a person based on this, but the actions I think are definitely reprehensible, that are outwardly insulting people and shaming people publicly for speaking out against anything that goes against the mainstream narrative. And it's this kind of cancel culture phenomenon that is extraordinarily worrying. And I would love to hear from you why you think
Okay.
that
So
it's
so
okay
I
to
think
speak about one side and not the other.
so you are attributing a couple things to me that I think are not accurate. One is that there is no opinion that I am afraid to express, not a one. I mean, I have gotten dragged so many times on this fucking bird site. I mean, I remember I was actually just telling the story recently. I was trying to have a nuanced discussion about race, and Talib Kweli, who was, you know, a one-time famous rapper and one-time famous Twitter troll, got into my mentions, and his entire army was sicked on me. And so like that was frustrating, and that's when I started to worry about, you know, the mob mentality. And I think my worry about woke culture and the consequences of that, and cancel culture, I'm extremely concerned about. And so I have no problem expressing viewpoints that are controversial. In fact, I might even lean into it a little too much. That might be something I'm guilty of. And just, you know, to give you a sense of my background, like I was a diehard conservative, you know, and a Republican, to use the U.S. term. You know, through high school, college, I wrote for the college conservative newspaper. I voted for McCain over Obama in 2008. And so, and then I have, you know, migrated left on a number of things, although I think the left-right distinction is uninteresting and maybe unapplicable to today. And so I'm comfortable having any viewpoint on the spectrum. So I think that is something I'm so glad that I have had, you know, these diverse experiences, or held a number of opposing viewpoints.
Yeah, I don't think I don't think I was saying that you weren't comfortable saying it. I think I
No,
was
no,
more
I
saying
wanted a
that
little bit,
it
wanted to just
seems like
defend myself.
you have a tendency of tribalism.
I can understand that, and I especially if you see tribalism everywhere you look, then it's probably, I can understand being sensitive to it, especially on this topic.
I'm not being sensitive. I mean, I've just seen you be really rude to me and anybody that disagrees with you.
And I apologize to you private message. I will apologize to you publicly. I have not been my best self on this topic. I think it's an emotionally fraught topic. I think I respect, you know, the desire to have bodily autonomy, and I think that you respect my desire to preserve human life. So I think that, like, both of us have you know, noble causes.
Right. Do you think that you have a tendency of tribalism? For this topic, at least.
I mean,
if you were like a staunch conservative before, and now you're like super aggressive towards people that disagree with you about the COVID stuff.
So I think that it's really important to understand, and I forgot to make a note of this, but I think that one of the things you mentioned that I wanted to respond to was how I respond to people, or how I talk with people who are opposed to me. And there are two types of people who disagree with me on any topic. There's the people who are approaching a topic in good faith, and there's the people who are approaching it in bad faith. I think you are approaching this in good faith. I get that vibe from you, and I've only moved further in that direction since we've begun this conversation. There are people who are approaching this in bad faith, who are looking for confirmatory evidence for their views. They swat away anything that might challenge their opinions. You know, a good test to see whether or not someone is, you know, a critical thinker is how much they know about the opposing viewpoint. And so I think that, and I feel bad, I keep dropping their names, but unfortunately they're like very well known in the poker community. Alex and Kristen are only sharing evidence with me that supports their viewpoint. They would never share something and say, hey, this is interesting and actually causes me to, you know, update in the other direction. It's only going to be one directional with them.
Can I
And
perhaps steelman their position? I have a deep respect for both of them in and out of poker. I know, for instance, Kristen, and I imagine Alex as well, just looking at him, they're very interested in health. I know Kristen, I've had a conversation with her in Vegas years ago, and she told me things about health that I did not know. And I was very big into health myself. And she's done a lot of her own research, and she has a lot of skepticism about the kind of public knowledge that's out there. And she's had a lot of success from, she's a very healthy looking person.
yes,
That's hard in America from what it looks like.
indeed.
And for the reason that I think that they may be, and obviously there's tribalistic instincts inside all of us. I wouldn't pass myself away from you or from anybody else. It's a spectrum. It'd be multiple spectra to judge how tribal somebody is in different topics. But perhaps one of the reasons that, and in fact, I can say with certainty, one of the reasons that they feel compelled to keep sharing data that support one side of the argument is because the vast majority of media, mainstream corporate media, tech giants, they're censoring that side of the argument and only promoting the mainstream establishment side of the argument. And I feel inside of me the resistance to that of stop telling me what to think, stop censoring the scientists that say the other thing. And it makes me want to say, no, but guys, seriously, there is another voice out here that you can listen to. There are fucking thousands of voices out here that you can listen to that disagree with the establishment. But for instance, one of my posts actually I just got a strike on Instagram because one of my posts I posted of Robert Malone speaking, and it got struck as misinformation. I had to take it down. I actually took down the other one that was on there as well because I don't want to lose my Instagram account. Like that censorship it's rife, and so I can respect and appreciate. Even though I would criticize perhaps the tribalistic instincts of people, I can't speak about these two people specifically too much because I don't know them too well. But it's a big thing they're up against. They're up against censorship. They're up against corporate big tech censorship to a level the world's never seen before.
But they are losing credibility because of how one-sided they are. And I don't think it's a strong argument to say that because they feel like there's an unbalance, that they get to counteract this unbalance unilaterally and just promote one side.
I agree. I'm just saying I appreciate it. I agree that it's not wise to.
I don't appreciate it, and I don't think it helps them at all.
Maybe appreciate is the wrong word, but I understand it.
I understand it as well. I think that that's the best I can do with these two is that if you feel like you're fighting a moral war, that it's going to be easy to defend any of the behaviors that you engage in to win that war. And I just think that this is unfortunately a strategy that's not serving them. And this is
it really sounds like you might have a bone to pick with these two, by the way. I'm not mentioning people who I've been speaking to online that I think have been pretty ridiculously obtuse, because I don't think that for me it doesn't feel right, and I don't think it is right. It isn't right. I'm going to say it isn't.
Well, we've talked about the value of transparency. I believe in radical transparency, and so if I have beef with Alex and Kristen, I want to talk about beef with Alex and Kristen. But the reason why. So I actually don't know that many people that hold their viewpoint. there's a handful of poker players and,
thousands of scientists.
Sure. Okay. There's 7.7 billion people in the world. Yes, there's going to be, I'm sure we could find 1,000 scientists that would
epidemiologists from Harvard, Cambridge, Oxford.
Yeah. In the same way that you don't want to have a discussion about vaccine efficacy, I don't want to have a discussion about the number of people who have said something that counteracts the narrative.
But I'm not suggesting we talk about numbers, but I'm suggesting that they're not saying anything radical. They're saying things that are supported by people who are at the top of their profession. And obviously there are people on both sides of the argument on the top of the profession. I'm not claiming consensus, but nor can you. And the things that Alex and Kristen are sharing, none of it's radical. All of it's
that's not true. That's not. So you have to be careful who you're defending here. So you don't know their entire corpus. Alex has famously said that he thinks that the true number of COVID deaths is only 6% of what it of the official totals.
Yeah,
and so like that is a
I have no idea what the true number is, but if it were 6%, I wouldn't be. I would be surprised if it was that low. Actually, I would. But
yeah,
if it were 20%,
radical,
I would not be surprised.
that is also a radical viewpoint. So I think that maybe we have different definitions of what radical is.
Yeah, I think
And
that's it. And I think perhaps if it is supported by scientists and epidemiologists, say, for instance, from Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Stanford, Yale, perhaps it ought not to be called radical, even if, you could call it going against the consensus. But radicals, it's a strong word for something that is supported by esteemed professionals.
I don't think that the preponderance of evidence is in support of the COVID death count being 5x what it actually is.
Yeah, okay, but just imagine that I'm sitting here as like Martin Kulldorff, or I'm sitting here as Professor Gupta, the one that I had an interview with. I don't know if you saw it. An Oxford epidemiologist or a Harvard epidemiologist and biostatistician and they were saying, I don't know what their exact position is on the death count, but let's say, for instance, they were saying, Martin Kulldorff was saying, I think it's around 50%, or I think it's around 20%. Would you have that kind of, it's kind of an arrogant attitude to say, well, it's definitely not this, it's radical to believe this, if it weren't me sitting in front of you and it was actually one of these esteemed professionals?
I mean, I don't think that one or two people or the 10,000 this is the difficulty of this, is that you have an interview with one or two people who make a claim, and that is supposed to again, going from like the Bayesian philosophy or the Bayesian worldview, those should be so minuscule, and I should not update in that direction at all, because it's so small relative to the number of people who are arguing that the COVID death count is accurate, if not undercounted.
I don't know if that's true, but even if it were true, even if there is a 95 to 99% consensus in your direction, if there are scientists who are esteemed and well-educated and a lot more knowledgeable about these phenomena than us that are saying the complete opposite, it's not radical to agree with them. They're not being radical. And to name it radical is an arrogant position where you're assuming that you have truth on your team. You can call it disagreeing with the majority, but at one point, people were describing the heliocentric idea of the solar system as radical. The idea that for people listening, the idea that the sun's at the center of the solar system. That was radical at one point, but it's not a radical position because it goes against the consensus.
But Charlie, that's argumentative sleight of hand, because you're saying that because a minority position ended up winning the day, that minority positions win the day much more often than they actually do.
No, I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is, to call it radical in the first place is an arrogance. And I don't think you're an arrogant person. I really love you, honestly, from just meeting you. But what I'm saying is to use this kind of inflammatory and certain language, it's saying that truth is on our team and you are the people who are wrong. And I just want to move away from that language and say they're not being radical. They're disagreeing maybe disagreeing with consensus. But I think in the death count, I don't actually, again, we spoke about betting on this offline. I would happily bet as much money as you want that if we chose even like 20 random scientists and then we reached out to as many as possible about whether the death count was undercounted or overcounted, that they would say it's undercounted. I'm on it. I will shake on it right now. But ignoring that, because it seems like you probably didn't actually want to bet.
No. That's not actually true. I think that I cared about the terms, and I think that as opposed to other prop bets that I've booked, like, I think you are much more willing to agree to a truly random sample of people.
No. I'm not saying random scientists. I'm saying that we choose somebody like Phil Galfond, somebody who's extraordinarily well trusted in the community, who perhaps he wouldn't be interested in doing this, to choose 10 esteemed scientists within the world of epidemiology who he deems to be unbiased. And we asked those 10 whether the COVID count was overcounted or undercounted. And if one of us wins by +2, then we win the bet for however much money you want. And I'm willing to bet on that right now.
Yeah, I think I'm fine with that as you described it, for global death count.
How much?
So I have to tell you that as a recently engaged person, and
I
don't
don't
know.
want to. I don't want to bankrupt your family or anything like that.
No, no,
But
no. I mean,
do you see what's happened here? Is that you were so certain as to call the disagreeing opinion radical, but then as soon as money's on the line, you're like, oh, I'm not that certain.
no. I mean, in the spirit of radical transparency, like I have told my fiance that I was not going to book large prop bets without talking to her. And this came up. This came up during the 2020 election, in which I bet the literal farm after the election was over. And I think it led to a discussion of like, okay, now that we are combining our lives, like this is. I mean, and you don't need to hear this, but yeah, I mean,
this. COVID aside for a second, what did you bet? I want to hear it.
After the election was over,
Mm-hmm.
I bet that Trump did not win the election. And I can't. You're not familiar with this? That like there was their markets were going. The election and prediction markets went crazy after the election was already over.
I didn't know that people carried on betting on it. I know that Trump was appealing it.
Oh my God! I was laying 8-1 2 weeks after the election was over.
Wow.
And there was effectively infinite action that you could book.
It's pretty wild.
It was insane. It was the most insane time of my life. Right. I always said if I wrote my memoirs, a chapter would just be like the month after the election.
Did you print?
Yes.
Congratulations.
Thank you. But honestly, I will say that I felt very conflicted about that. That I worry about. I worry about an environment in which people believe things so adamantly that they're willing to deny the reality before them because of their tribalism, because of their party membership.
I worry about
people who were otherwise sharp were giving me action, and at a certain point I started to feel guilty, and I got laughed at by a lot of my friends. I was like, I can't take this money anymore. This money is dirty to me. Like I think that I don't see how it's different than a drug dealer, who is making money off of someone who's addicted, or someone in religion who's taking donations from someone. But although I mean this actually kind of is difficult as a poker player, because as poker players, like it's a predatory profession and ecosystem. And honestly, I don't know if I could have stayed in poker had it not been for effective altruism, because that gave me an excuse to keep playing. But that's kind of how I viewed the bet. But at a certain point, it got unpalatable for me.
Yeah, I disagree that it was wrong of you to take the bet, but we don't need to. We maybe privately can speak about that. That's an interesting topic for sure.
But yes, no.
Just so you know, we did speak about the bet maybe a few days ago now, and yes. I did lay out the terms. It's pretty much exactly the same then.
No, I didn't know that it was let's choose a member of the poker community who will then choose a handful of scientists.
Oh, I think that sounds like I misread that then.
Yeah, apologies. So so let's say we have a bet booked and we just have to choose the amount.
Up to you. Yeah.
Okay.
Maximum. Although if it's small enough, if it's below a certain amount, then first of all, it's probably not worth my time, and second of all, it's not worth doing it and reaching
the hassle.
Scientists. Yeah. I will go minimum 15.
Okay.
15K.
I will speak to my better half. I don't think there will have a problem. But like I said, I think that the conversation is more important than the bet, honestly. And maybe that's I don't know.
I'm just trying to print, honestly.
I understand, and it is funny that we are, I think, relatively smart individuals who both think that we have clear locks on this, and so. That must mean that we have very different knowledge bases, of course. I mean, you've had intimate conversations with people who feel strongly the other way. I would say that I'm a little more removed from, or I'm not as deeply connected to my position because it's informed by, data and not people that I've spoken to.
So
Like,
let's try and dig into the death count, just because even though it's not the most important thing in the world, I really think the most important thing is standing up against these totalitarian measures. But just
I agree with you. I was so excited to talk to you about policies because that's where the nuance lies.
yeah, we'll get back into that. I'm just very curious
Sure.
at the moment when we're looking at, say, for instance, the UK, and it's the US as well, but I'll take the UK because I'm more familiar with the data.
Of course.
The unprecedented fashion of diagnosis, where anybody that's diagnosed positive of a PCR, or I think of other COVID tests as well, but they said publicly PCR, so that's the one they were using, and then dies within 28 days of any cause within the hospital, whether it's lung disease, whether it's a heart attack, whether it's suicide, whether it's whatever it is. If they die within that hospital, they were diagnosed positive with COVID up to 28 days ago, they were put down as a COVID death. Now, that's never happened before in medical history. Why do you think that happened? And how do you think that could lead to anything but a vast overcounting of deaths?
So I have heard discussion of this policy of attributing deaths of all causes to COVID if there is a COVID positive test. While I do think that could lead to a slight overcounting at the margin, it doesn't explain the fact that we have this excess mortality in every country around the world. And so for people who aren't familiar, basically mortality across time is incredibly constant. You can predict the number of people that are going to die in a given month in non-pandemic times in any country, like plus or minus 5%. It's incredibly stable year over year, month over month.
It's maximum 10% ever.
Max 10%. Okay, and so then we have the pandemic in January 2020. And you start to see this divergence of the predicted mortality and the actual mortality. So this is called excess mortality. And the problem with that is at that time, there's really nothing else that you could attribute the increase in mortality to other than COVID. It's kind of like you have this treatment control where the control is previous mortality and the treatment is this pandemic, and any difference is going to be the deaths due to the pandemic.
What about
and
lockdowns?
So, pardon?
What about lockdowns?
What do you mean, what about lockdowns?
They killed so many people throughout the world.
I'm not understanding your argument.
Lockdowns killed a huge amount of people in every single country that they were enacted.
I don't know what that means. What do you mean? How does the lockdown kill? What's the mechanism?
Well, the loads of mechanisms, suicide for one, the lack of treatments for various diseases, the inability to screen for things like cancer. There's a list of these things that epidemiologists have looked at, and in the data set in the UK, a large proportion of the excess deaths that weren't accounted for were attributed to lockdowns. And this is only in the UK, by the way. In the third world countries, millions upon millions of people are starving to death because of the global economic collapse. And
so
lockdowns kill, man.
So I have not heard this argument. Or I mean, I guess I've heard it, but not as detailed as you. So suicides is usually the common one that I get, is that, oh, people are depressed during the pandemic and they commit suicide at higher rates. Every time I've dug into this across multiple countries, I am not seeing any increase in suicides. And suicides are not a death that are going to be attributed to COVID. Suicides are actually like something that we can count pretty exactly, at least in the West.
How about this? How about we look at, and I've already looked at this, but what about we distinguish the difference between people that have died in a hospital, which is where the COVID deaths are, and then people that have died at home? And a large proportion of the excess deaths in the UK came from people that died at home. Again, I can't speak about the US because I really only looked at the UK data on this because it's such a specific branch of the COVID tree. But you can't argue that people are dying at home from COVID because they don't.
I can't argue that people are dying at home are dying from COVID. Is that what you're saying? Why can't that be argued?
Because the vast majority of people that die of COVID die in the hospital. You get hospitalized, you get even sicker, and then you die. The percentage of people that are dying of COVID from home is tiny.
Yeah, I guess I've never thought to look into death. Like, I wasn't even sure this was available in the death data, at least in the US, the data that I know much better. I don't know if it's split by, whether you die in the hospital or die at home. But I do know in the US that death rates are higher in states that have lower vaccination rates. So, like, to me, the mechanism seems.
Do you mean death
obvious.
rates overall, or death rates of COVID?
Well, I mean, it's inferred that it's death rates from COVID, unless you think that somehow remaining unvaccinated increases your deaths of other things.
Just checking.
Yeah. I mean, I have to wrap my head around this, because I've never heard someone put it that lockdowns are killing people or that there's mass starvation. I was not aware of any kind of increase in the rate of starvation.
Millions upon millions of people. I think the World Bank estimated that in 2020 alone, 150 million people were pushed towards extreme poverty.
Well, I mean,
and that there's also been a lot of analysis on starvation as well. I'm not just saying that these people are going to necessarily die. These aren't my arguments. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here.
Sure. I mean, my understanding of extreme poverty is that it's strictly declined every year since 1970. So I was not aware of there being
until 2020. We were lifting people out at an unprecedented rate until 2020. 40,000 people a day until 2020, and then it dropped to such a huge extent. It's very hard to calculate. We have models, we have estimates, but it's very hard.
However, I think my understanding of excess mortality is actually it's much lower in the developing countries, because they seem to be somewhat, I don't want to say COVID immune, but COVID is less of a concern in Africa, for example, partly because, I mean, this is another point of agreement, that they have adequate vitamin D, and vitamin D is extremely prophylactic in terms of keeping COVID at bay. So I don't, even if I accept your premise that plenty of people are dying because of the economic collapse, which is actually going to happen regardless of the policy responses. So let's say we say that the policy was awful and that they had a better response. I don't know if that would have prevented economic collapse, especially considering that a lot of people...
I'm just going to be harsh with you here, dude. You're speaking about something you evidently know very little about.
What is it you think?
You obviously know a lot about economics, but to do the lockdowns and the effects on lockdowns, epidemiologists across the world have been studying this. Papers have been released left, right. There's so many papers that have been released on this, and people that have studied this to such a depth and that have come to these conclusions. It doesn't seem to be argued. I've never come across significant rebuttal from a scientist about the damage that lockdowns have done. And you're speaking about something that you've admitted you haven't read about, which is fair enough. Nobody's read about everything.
I know, but I've read at least one economic paper on the effect of lockdowns, and I think it was found that they didn't have a huge effect on reducing transmission or reducing deaths. So I actually think lockdowns were not effective as policy, but I've never heard anyone argue. And I mean, this just might be we're in different silos here.
I will link you to papers and experts and everything that this is.
I would honestly welcome that, because I've never heard someone argue in good faith that lockdowns were killing people.
Yeah. I mean, however, to paraphrase Sunetra Gupta, the Oxford epidemiologist that I had on my podcast, and I didn't know all of her positions on everything before I got her on. But one of the things that she said is the reason that she was so motivated to keep speaking out against these things is because of the devastation that she knew it was causing to third world countries. Lockdowns protected rich people, and they sent poor people off to work, or they collapsed the economies of third world countries, leading to the starvation of children and adults and families, and tearing communities apart. Because what happens is when you stop people from going to work, you destroy the supply chains, you destroy the GDP, which is closely related, as I'm sure you know, to the foreign aid budget. You decimated the charity sector, which again, I'm sure you're very familiar with, as am I. And all of these things have been going towards keeping people who are on the brink of poverty alive, and they've been decimated. And this is one of the things that from day one I was speaking out against, because I heard the experts speak about this and I said, that makes a lot of fucking sense. I think we should do whatever we can to stop these lockdowns.
The pandemic has, of course, affected people of low socioeconomic status much more than high socioeconomic status individuals. You can lock yourself in your castle for years and be fine. The person that relies on living paycheck to paycheck, of course, is going to be more adversely affected. I'm actually so glad that the U.S. government had the best response in terms of payments during the pandemic, for people who were unemployed or adversely affected. However, I worry that you're leaning quite heavily on this Dr. Gupta that you.
No. This is one of many. I was just paraphrasing to get a quote, or like a paraphrase quote. But she's, I mean, the people that signed the Great Barrington Declaration that she was a co-signatory of, it was 60,000 medical professionals and scientists. 60,000.
Yeah, I don't know much about. I've heard Great Barrington mentioned a couple of times. I don't know that much about it. I do think that without looking at the papers, I could imagine a methodology that would associate lockdowns with deaths, because you're going to institute lockdowns in countries that have big COVID problems. And so without knowing the direction of causation, don't roll your eyes.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to meditate. I'm trying not to say anything snarky or anything. That's my bad. I should be able to maintain a stoic face, but I'm just breathing.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm happy to look into this. All I can tell you is that I am willing to take a look at what you send me, because you appear to be operating in good faith. I have seen correlation and causation mistakes made all the time. If there's anything I'm an expert in, is discerning correlation from causation.
But do you see what's happening here? I'm saying that there are 60,000 medical professionals, including epidemiologists, who have spent their whole lives studying these phenomena. And the instant reaction you have to saying that is like, it's not saying, oh, I might have been wrong on this, let me try and change my priors. It's saying, well, I think I could think of a way they might be wrong, without even looking at it.
I'm happy to look at it. I think extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, Charlie, and I think that you don't see it that way. I think you think everything is roughly.
What do you mean? What do you mean?
This is an extraordinary claim,
and they have extraordinary amount of data. They've been doing studies, meta-analyses, peer-reviewed studies. There's a ton of it.
I don't know why. I don't know why I'm supposed to grant you the quality of your evidence.
I'm not asking you to you know what? I'll bet on it. I'll give you 5-1.
But I don't even know what we're betting on, because it's unclear to me.
Yeah,
you're saying that these people,
like the amount of papers that have come out about lockdown harm, the amount of epidemiologists that have been speaking out against this. There's a ton of things that I've been keeping up to date with, and it feels like again, I'm not saying this is an insult. I really don't want to cause any conflict here, but it seems like you haven't been reading specifically about this part of the pandemic response as much as I have, which is okay, and it doesn't mean I'm right. But what it means is that I'm telling you all of these facts, and I can't prove it to you unless you. But I'm telling you all of these studies. I'm telling you all of these experts, and I can't prove that they exist because you haven't seen it.
So earlier I used the word radical, and I think that it's too. I'll concede that maybe that is too loaded a term, and I will not use that term going forward. That there's like a minority opinion or majority opinion. I think I would ask that you could also grant me not using the word facts.
I understand what you're saying. I didn't mean facts as in like the efficacy of lockdowns or anything like that. I meant the facts that these studies.
The sheer number of people who are on the other side here, this 60,000, epidemiologists, other science. Listen, I'm happy to take a look at it. I do think that the preponderance of the evidence is on one side versus the other, but I don't want to say that your viewpoint is radical. I'm happy. And honestly, I'm unprepared because I never thought that we would have a conversation in which you would say that lockdowns killed people, because it never even occurred to me.
So like the best argument. Do you remember what you were saying earlier about the idea of critical thinking being how well you can describe the opponent's arguments? I can describe the pro-lockdown argument back to front. I know.
Yeah, and now
as well as I know the anti-lockdown arguments.
Yeah,
but you're telling me that you haven't researched this, and you're still coming to conclusions.
So I think that it didn't occur to me that the lockdown would prevent people from getting medical care, which I believe is what you're arguing, is that people who needed medical care were not able to get it because they were
I think
there
were like an estimated something like 1 million people that just didn't get their tuberculosis treatment, and I think hundreds of thousands of people died just of tuberculosis extra than normal because of the lockdown. So that's one disease.
Now TB. So we're talking about the developing world, right? Because there's no way people in the UK are getting TB.
This is all in developing world. People don't die of TB in England, of course.
Right. Well, not since
vaccines. By the way, also, I think vaccines are one of the best inventions ever given to.
I assumed that I would never give you credit for another opinion. I recognize that the overwhelming majority of people are pro-vaccine, but they have specific opposition to this one vaccine or treatment. If you don't like the word vaccine, I think that's a silly semantic debate that's not even worth going into, because we both know what the other person means. So let's not get hung up on the word.
The reason that I'm very cautious about using the word vaccine is because of the inflammatory way that the word is used, and the inflammatory way that the term anti-vax or vaccine hesitancy is used, where it's like, if you're anti one vaccine, suddenly you're anti all vaccines because of this word that just kind of mars it all with the same brushstroke. Or if you're vaccine hesitant, now suddenly it sounds like you're vaccine hesitant, but you're just hesitant with this one specific vaccine, which didn't actually, the mRNA vaccines didn't even count as vaccines until they changed the definition in 2020, decades after the technology was actually invented.
Yeah, regardless, I mean, vaccine hesitancy is a problem prior to COVID. So in the latest survey that I was able to find in 2018, when asked, do you think vaccines are safe? 50% of Americans said no. So I'm concerned about...
I don't think vaccines are safe. I think most vaccines that are publicly available are safe. I don't think all vaccines are safe.
I mean, I think that's implied by the question, but given that the same question is asked across all countries and the US is on the low end, as is most of Western Europe, for some reason, Eastern Europe and Asia and Africa are much more bullish on vaccines. And so there is a trend of the West, I think, preferring naturalism, with regard to their medicine. And so I was worried about this prior to COVID. COVID, I think, has only magnified it. And it doesn't shock me that the countries that have low vaccine rates were also the countries that were vaccine hesitant in 2018. So I think there is a bigger problem here. And I do think that COVID has been practiced for a real pandemic, because I'm curious how this conversation goes down, with a disease like the Spanish flu. I mean, that's killing, I just watched Station 11, and this is a disease that kills I think it's 99% or 99.9% of people it infects. Clearly, as the lethality increases, we have to...
Which disease has that level of lethality?
Oh, it's a fictitious. It's Stations 11 is... sorry, no, I should have made that clear. It's a series, I think, on Hulu or HBO, but it's based on a book. But anyway, it's kind of a post-apocalyptic society. What happens when we lose all of our technology and everything like that? We have to start from scratch. But anyway, I think that the response, and this is one of the things that makes COVID so fucking difficult, is that it's a disease that's relatively benign if you're young and awful if you're really old, and relatively benign if you're healthy and really awful if you're really not healthy. And so that, as if it would have been hard enough if it was a disease that affected everyone equally. I mean, for example, polio, there was a great vaccination uptake because this was something that was killing kids. And we care a lot when kids are killed. We care a lot less when the elderly are killed.
Yeah, which is one of the reasons why the Great Barrington Declaration proposes focused protection, where we protect the people who are vulnerable so they don't have to go out and do their fucking shopping and whatnot, and we allow the healthy people that aren't going to die from this disease to go out and keep society alive so we don't collapse the economy.
Honestly, in a world in which we just vaccinate, if you were, I don't know how this would be instituted, but if you were to vaccinate people in proportion to their risk, and you could do it in an authoritarian way, we would have prevented tons of death in the US, and we would not have had the recession that we had, most likely. Unfortunately, the people that were resistant to the vaccine largely were people who were, I shouldn't say were largely, many of people who were resistant to the vaccine were unhealthy and were at great risk. But I am not worried about the 25-year-old who's not getting vaccinated. That's not who I'm worried about. I'm so tired of these 55, 60-year-olds living in red states that voted for Trump that are on their deathbed saying they'd rather die than get this vaccine. That's the problem we have in the US.
And God bless them for choosing their death. You know, if they've chosen something that's going to kill them, God bless them, because that's one of the most sacred things that a human can ever have, is the choice between life and death and the choice of bodily autonomy. And if he's delusional, that's a shame, but we should never force them.
Yeah,
death
I mean,
is not the worst thing in the world when, like, death of one person isn't the worst thing in the world when we're talking about a global scale.
I mean, the use of the word autonomy is interesting here, isn't it? Because, I mean, you think these people are making this like admirable decision, and I think
I'm not saying it's admirable. I personally,
sorry, you respect their freedom to make that choice.
Yeah.
And I would argue, and then this probably unwinds into a discussion of free will versus determinism, but like I would argue that they haven't made this choice for them, that it's the media that they choose, it's the tribalism, where you know, the Republican Party in the US. And again, I'm so sorry that I'm speaking about the US situation because you're much more familiar with like what's going on.
No, I've been following the US situation deeply.
Okay. So unfortunately, like, membership of the Republican Party is more and more requiring that you are opposed to these vaccines, and Republican politicians have to lie or evade the question of whether or not they've been vaccinated because they know it'll lead to electoral success.
Yeah.
And that's crazy town.
Yeah, in the same way that to be a successful Democrat, you're going to have to be pro a number of things. Like both sides in the political spectrum are borderline insane because people have to be to succeed in the system. Yeah,
I don't think that those viewpoints are symmetrical.
Yeah, well, that's what the other side would say about you. So I'm a big fan of not kind of falling into the struggle nature and just not labeling people in general.
So
like that.
But Charlie, here's the important difference. Republicans who chose the vaccine are not willing to admit to their base that they got the vaccine, and therefore are making it more likely that their base will not get vaccinated. However, the Democrats.
What about Democrats who are going to be lying about getting the vaccine or not saying that they didn't get the vaccine, which is undoubtedly happening?
But it's
given the amount of people that are Democrats.
Would you grant me
not just the mirror opposite?
Would you grant me that the number of Republicans who are getting vaccinated who are not being public about it is larger than the number of Democrats who are not getting vaccinated who are not being public about it?
It has to be, because most people are getting vaccinated in the US.
The base rates alone are going to take care of that.
But still, it's a mirror image of one another, and this is the problem with tribalism. It's so easy to point to the other side of the castle and say, your castle's got loads of moss in it. I can see it from here. And then not be able to see the moss on your inside of the castle.
Yeah, I guess I just worry that what does it say about a politician that is going to do what they think is best, which is to get vaccinated? Let's assume a Republican politician, like the governor of Florida, I think is, last time I checked, has not been public about his vaccine status.
Oh, no.
But I think
the governor of Florida is super pro-vaccine. He's always telling people to get vaccinated.
I thought that
he's always he's super.
Has he set his own status?
I think so. I think that it's at least implied. I don't know if he's explicitly said it, because those words might not come out of his mouth, but he's at least saying over and over again, people should get vaccinated.
Got it. Okay, so I think there are some other people, more extreme wings, a more extreme wing of the Republican Party.
There are a bunch of crazies out there that will do anything to succeed. I'm with you, man.
Sure. And I worry that the people that elect those politicians are going to be easily influenced and will choose not to get vaccinated because of the tribalism. And now I understand the concern, and I really do agree that tribalism is present on both sides. It's a plague on both of our houses. But the thing is that it's asymmetric in the sense that a Republican who is, in one way or another, convincing their base not to get vaccinated or to push the needle towards not getting vaccinated, that's increasing
nice pun there, by the way.
totally unintentional.
I know.
That they're increasing the mortality of the people that elected them.
Right. So on the other side, they would look at Democrats and say that they're increasing the mortality because they're encouraging people to get vaccinated, even though they haven't themselves. It's the exact same thing.
Right, but I don't think there's any mortality increase by encouraging vaccination.
They do think that.
I understand, but hold on.
So
Charlie,
one side thinks
Charlie,
that, and the other side thinks the mirror image.
Hold on a second. So, are you saying that you don't believe that the vaccines are preventing death?
Whoa. Be specific with what you're saying. I personally,
if we have, let me clarify my claim, because you caught me. I was very unspecific there. If vaccination is targeted at higher risk individuals, is that going to lead to a reduction in death?
If I had to bet on it, it would be no.
It'd be no?
Yeah, it would be no. But I'm so uncertain about that I don't even bother saying my opinion. We're just talking about COVID-19 specifically, right? COVID-19 vaccine.
COVID-19.
Yeah, we're just talking about like Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and whatever else.
We gather up every person in the U.S. that is north of 70. We split them into two groups. We vaccinate one half, and we don't vaccinate the other. You think mortality is going to be the same in both groups?
Yeah, I'd bet on it, but with maybe like a 65% certainty or something like that. And again, this is something that I'm open to being wrong about, but from the data that I've seen, the hideous undercounting of the side effects and the lack of protection that the vaccines are given in comparison to something like natural immunity, I'd bet on it.
Well, hold on a second.
But it's impossible to bet on.
Right, but I'm saying, like, if you're 70, I don't see how you're going to get natural immunity without catching COVID, which is the thing so to prevent you dying from.
The argument that, say, for instance, Dr. Peter McCullough made and lots of other scientists are making is that the people who are dying of the vaccine side effects are the same people that would die from COVID as well, because the immune system, the immune response is not as strong as others, and the things that are happening from the vaccine side effects are causing a larger influx of mortality within the people that were more susceptible to COVID. That would be the argument, and that's the one that I personally believe in. But at the same time, I just don't care to speak about these things because it's like, well, I might be wrong, and you might be wrong, by the way.
But they matter greatly when we're talking about policy, because I actually understand your viewpoint a lot more now, that if you don't think these vaccines are providing benefit,
you don't understand it anymore based on that. My viewpoint has got nothing to do whether I think the vaccines are plus or minus EV. The policy actually is completely separate to that.
But it shouldn't be. They're correlated.
Okay, so if there was a disease that had 100% mortality for people, and we had
let's not use 100%.
Okay, if we had a disease that had 90% mortality for people, something like that, and we had a vaccine that was not 100% efficacious, maybe say like 50% efficacious at preventing death from the disease, and also was 100% good, 100% efficacious at preventing spread of the disease. In that universe, I could be behind a mandate, but we're so far from that universe that I think that these mandates are completely outrageous. I think that now, especially with Omicron, I mean, Omicron's less deadly than the fucking influenza. Were you talking about forced mandatory vaccines or making it difficult for people that didn't get their flu shots in 2017, which I did, by the way, regretfully, because I actually think it was minus EV with those specific.
I've never gotten a flu shot. Ever.
You anti-vaxxer. How many vaccines have you had in your life? Oh, you're American, you probably win this, but I've had more flu shots. I think I got 4 in that one jab. You anti-vaxxer. Do you know you could have been spreading the flu to somebody's grandma and causing their grandma to die? Should we not have made life extraordinarily difficult for Andrew Barber? Because he decided to put his own delusional self before the well-being of others in 2017. In fact, throughout his whole life.
No, I just wanted to be honest. And for me, it was, every year I've done a cost benefit analysis. A long time ago, someone said that because the flu affects young children and the elderly, if you are around young children or the elderly often, then you should get the flu shot. I've never in my life been in a setting which I was around the elderly or extremely young children.
Confirmed. Cancel Andrew Barber. Get this anti-vaxxer off this platform, boys. Report this video and report into the CCP. You see that we might be in a bit of a tangle here intellectually, because
No. I think if anything, this gives me
a disease which is now less deadly than influenza.
Well, hold on a sec, Charlie, but that's not true. So like, I know the death count in the US in the month of January alone, I believe 60,000 Americans died from, which had to be Omicron, right? Because in January.
With COVID. From about a week ago, I haven't checked the data in about a week. From about a week ago, guess how many people in Israel have died from Omicron?
In Israel?
Yeah, the highest vaccinated. So they're doing well. The cases were through the roof, unfortunately.
Overall for the entire pandemic, or particular?
No, just Omicron. Just Omicron.
Just Omicron. Okay. So it's number of deaths since what would that be? The turn of the year or late December?
I mean, I don't know how they were determining when it.
Sorry, I'm just trying to make a good estimate because I have no fucking idea.
These are data that came out of Israel.
Do you know the population of Israel?
The answer is zero. The answer is 0 deaths from Omicron. Sorry to take away your guessing fun. I could see you.
No. I would have never gotten there. How is that possible?
Potentially, and this is what we heard when South Africa first found Omicron, and were reporting vastly. The doctors were saying, hey, by the way, this is basically a cold. Nobody's dying over here. Potentially, Omicron isn't as deadly as you think it is.
But we know in the US that's just not true.
How much of the US data have you dug into? How much of it was with COVID? How much of it was of COVID?
So the width of COVID, I think, is most interesting when it comes to hospitalization. So basically, hospitals had a policy, I forget when they instituted it. Let's say you break your arm and you are in the hospital, and then you take a COVID test and you have COVID while you're there, you are going to be, I think, indicated as a COVID hospitalization, which is why our COVID hospitalization rate went through the roof within the last couple of months. However, deaths are not going to be the same.
Deaths I don't know about right now, but deaths throughout a lot of the pandemic were counted in a very similar way to the way they were counted in the UK.
But again, we come back to the excess mortality discussion, which is, you think the excess mortality has to do with, I mean, it can't be lockdowns because there are no lockdowns now.
The excess mortality data, by the way, is extraordinarily hard to find. It's not.
Why is it hard? It's not hard to find at all.
The UN's being, as Elon Musk tweeted, the US the UN is being kind of weird about the mortality.
No, sorry. Finally, we're getting into something that's in my wheelhouse. So, like, Our World in Data is a great resource for global country level mortality, and then within the US, the CDC has an entire section dedicated to excess mortality. And then if you don't trust them, you can go to the state level. So any state you're curious about is going to have mortality data as well.
This is something you know more about than me. Tell me about the excess mortality since Omicron became the more the front strain.
So the belief, first of all, I want to preface this by saying, like, I do think that Omicron is the end of this pandemic. Like, hopefully there's not going to be egg on my face, but I think Omicron is, by nature of the number of people that have been infected, the fact that it provides immunity towards previous strains, and the fact that the virus
I didn't know that, by the way. I didn't know that it provided immunity towards previous strains. I assumed it would, but I'd never heard that as a fact.
Yeah, so like, for example, the reason we probably know a lot of people, and it might be yourself included, but like a lot of people got Delta and Omicron, is that Delta does not provide immunity towards Omicron, but Omicron immunity provides immunity towards previous strains. So yeah. Omicron, that's why Omicron became the dominant strain, was because of this asymmetry in the immunity. So anyway, I think Omicron ends this. So like, hopefully, in the next couple of weeks, like, we will see this going away. I know that, like, some of the cool data, they test for the virus in wastewater. So like poop data, it's been called. They see like a marked decrease in the virus present in the wastewater. But in January, when we thought we were done with this, and Omicron, which was safer, unfortunately, it's more virulent, and so more people got it. And so the death count actually went up in January versus the previous months. And the US lost 60,000 people in January, which is like quite incredible when you realize that it had already killed a bunch of elderly and sick people. So like the supposed like healthier US that still remained after, 900,000 people had been killed, of the healthy people that, I mean, I use healthy like, relatively speaking, we still lost 60,000 people.
How do you weigh up why there's such a disparity between the American data and like such a disparity, like between 0 and 60,000 is obviously an infinite proportionality.
Yeah.
Why do you think that might be the case?
The difference, I mean, if we take Israel's data, at face value, which I think 0 is almost certainly got to be wrong, but let's say that it's
they have a very good way of checking. I mean, they have a very
I suppose it's possible. I suppose it's possible that it's accurate, but like I actually think that there's probably like error and noise in that, and that it's maybe 0 plus. It can't. I mean, it's bounded one direction, but let's say it's like 0 plus or minus 10 or 20 or something like that. That seems much more plausible.
Yeah, I'm open to that being the case for sure. Yeah.
The reason why that seems plausible in Israel is because they have such a high rate of boosting, and the boosters apparently seem to be quite effective, preventing any of the serious outcomes from Omicron. Whereas in the U.S., we're like the least boosted country.
I've seen loads of studies that say that the boosters aren't effective against Omicron. But anyway, I don't care about this. I don't care about this. I really want to get down to what you said there. You think that Omicron might be the end of the pandemic?
I believe so.
We can hold on to this for a second. If we're looking at a disease which is less deadly than influenza, which you already decided you didn't want to get vaccinated for, and I appreciate the transparency, by the way, I really do appreciate the honesty.
I don't agree with you that it's less deadly than the flu.
Oh, do you want to bet on that?
Again, how is that structured?
I don't know, but we could do the same kind of structure where we get somebody we trust to ask a bunch of experts that are unbiased and go for the same kind of thing. We can message afterwards. I'll bet as much as you want. Anyway,
sure. I guess I don't know how in the worst years for the flu that we lost fewer people than in 1 month of Omicron. A lot of people died in America at the beginning of the 2021. It's interesting that
the big spike in mortality. But we don't need to go there. We don't need to hypothesize in why that happened. But let's look at the present, the now. We have a disease which is at least similar to the flu. Although I would bet a lot of money it's a lot.
I'm happy.
We don't think so. We still don't think. Okay. How much more deadly do you think Omicron is than the flu? Roughly, so kind of like how many people it's bound to kill?
I mean, actually, the thing that we have to keep in mind here, I hate to complicate this, is that we are experiencing Omicron in a society that is heavily vaccinated. So we don't know how many Omicron would have killed in a world where
we're talking about in reality where loads of people, like majority of people have been infected, they have prior infection, the majority of people are vaccinated in
Omicron I think is, man, whatever I say I'm going to be wrong, but I want to be conservative in the spirit of this discussion. I think 2x worse than like a normal flu season.
Okay, so now we're looking back at you, Andrew Barber, back in 2016 or whatever, and you decided every year not to get the flu shots. Are you 100% certain that you want to get the boosters for Omicron?
Well, I already got the booster for Omicron.
Well, when the next one rolls out, because Pfizer's shareholders getting antsy.
I think it will be a function of how, like, what the state of affairs is. So like, I think that there's been some news recently about how Denmark has adjusted their policies based on what the conditions are within the country. And I actually think that it's a great example for other countries to have a data-based approach. So like, I don't think you need to push boosting in a country that no longer has a virus problem.
Yeah.
However, I think I would get a booster if like I was in a community in which the virus was spreading rapidly.
Fair enough. So, it's a close spot depending on a lot of circumstances. So we can assume that if for you, somebody who's very, very on the side of these vaccines being very safe and very efficacious, we can assume that it's, it depends for you, which is, I think, a very fair statement. And I appreciate, again, the honesty. Can we both agree that for Omicron, fuck Delta and all this shit, for Omicron specifically, these mandates are completely nonsensical? The upside is so tiny and the downside is so huge. And that when we're looking at China, when we're looking at Austria, and when we're looking at Germany, places that have gone full pedal to the metal totalitarianism, we can outwardly say on Twitter, together as friends, holding hands, we'll get Ike in here, fucking come on, get in here, boy, and say these mandates are wrong. We should not be creating.
You will never get Ike to agree with you on this for what it's worth.
100%. I love Ike. I got so much admiration for him, but goddamn, he's got his opinions, man. He's got his opinions.
Yeah. No, it's honestly, I think it's the curse of being really smart that you can argue for anything.
Yeah,
and it's dangerous. It's
at the speed of light.
Motivated reasoning.
People are such bad addicts.
Motivated reasoning is a hell of a drug.
And I think it's also a very good example of, was it Epicurus or somebody that says that an education of the mind without an education of the heart is no education at all. And I think that he's I think he's a well-intentioned person, or at least I don't know if he's a well-intentioned person. At least he's not given me loads of reason to believe he's not. At least, in terms of what he wants for society, but when somebody is so intellectually based and so out of touch with their heart, or what we would call intuition, it causes its own flavor of delusion. And for me, it's really sad to see somebody that's gone. I loved him. Like, my first profile picture in poker was me and him sitting next to each other, and I was once such a big fan. And I still love him. I still have so much love for that human being. But to see somebody that's so far off the deep end, it honestly makes me really sad. And
I think that there's tons of intellectuals on the left, and I think it's because it's a really easy political viewpoint to defend intellectually.
Oh, it's so easy. If I could be on every side of every argument on the left, I'd be happy. It'd be so nice. It's just you guys are racist. What you can say about that?
No, it's the ultimate trump card. It is the ultimate trump card. And this is, I come from the world of academia, although I'm going to be, leaving it shortly. I'm on the job market right now. But it's, one of the things that's great about economics is I think that it seems to be one of the few disciplines that's managed to extricate itself from the political morass of political correctness and cancel culture, and is really concerned with data and evidence-based policy. Like, there's an obsession in economics to only make what are called positive statements versus normative. This is the way the world is, this is what the data is, versus this is the way the world should be. And that is such an invaluable way of seeing the world, because then you don't have any personal biases. You just let the data tell you what it's going to tell you. And the best researchers, the most intellectually honest researchers, will come to surprising conclusions. That you'll do research on so this is like a random topic, but it's been on my feed recently. Pre-K, like schooling for students before kindergarten. You assume it's going to be a strictly positive thing. Like, it's going to be benefit children to have education earlier in life.
The research in pre-K.
Yeah, so the research has suggested now that it's actually worse than the alternative. And so I think this has caused quite a stir.
What's the alternative? Homeschooling or no schooling or Waldorf schooling or what?
Waldorf, yeah, that's cute. In the US, are you kidding me? No.
Sorry. Too used to my cushy UK times.
Yeah, exactly. No, they send them to Cambridge. They get them. They give them books.
sit in circles singing Kumbaya, and everyone's getting along.
No, I think the alternative is so like a private program, but I think what the majority of families are doing are just keeping the kids at home.
Yeah.
And so what I think that this research reveals, I mean, I don't want to get on this too much, but like
we should do another podcast just talking about non-COVID stuff, man. I'd love to have you on.
Yeah, my pleasure. But I appreciate the honesty of the people that produce the research, because for an education researcher to say that this education is doing harm takes some balls, I think. And so I'd like to think that if I were in a similar situation, that I could produce similar research. If I was researching a COVID topic and I found that lockdowns were lethal, using the toolkit that I have built over the last few years, if I found they were lethal, I would happily run with that. I would say, oh, this is a surprise. This is interesting. I didn't expect this.
Yeah.
And so that's how I approach this topic.
I would love to be able to point you towards maybe, I don't know if you'd rather look at the raw data yourself. It's a very multivariate analysis to look at, or perhaps
I would like to look at the raw data.
Yeah, I mean, I can send you towards a lot of studies for that. But maybe just to finish, because like I said before, I just did over a 3-hour podcast.
No, I know. I appreciate
before we hopped on. And I want to go spend some time with my lovely Hannah.
Sure.
Where is the line for you? Where do you start speaking out against these totalitarian measures? Because for me, this vaccine stuff, it's all noise. And the real concern that I have is that in China right now, millions of people are being put in concentration quarantine camps.
Yeah. No.
And in Australia, Aboriginals are getting locked up, and in other countries, that like disgusting things are happening, and it seems to be getting worse and worse and worse in some countries. When am I gonna start seeing you liking my tweets and and Alex's and Kristen's?
Again, I do have to emphasize, like, the approaching topics in good faith is extremely important to me, and it's the thing that I value more than anything else. So like an example of someone who I think does this really well, like a public intellectual that does this really well, is Sam Harris. So Sam Harris, I'm almost always going.
I have the opposite opinion.
I think
Sam Harris, but
I think any philosopher tends to approach things in good faith. So anyway, we can punt on that for another time.
Yeah.
But I do appreciate the question, like, where's the line? Because that's what I anticipated this being a discussion about. That for me, COVID is the interesting edge case, because it's not so lethal that it should be an all hands on deck situation where we shut down borders to prevent like travel across, between countries. If China, if the virus had been extremely lethal, then I would have wanted all travel from China restricted like that. I think that would have made sense. And so all
Trump
travel, pardon?
Trump style.
Well, I if I recall, I don't think he was like quick to acknowledge the.
He was like, we should close the borders, and everyone in the media were like, he's racist.
No, but I actually think he wanted to close the borders after people had already come from China. I played in a card room with someone who had just flown in from Wuhan, days after.
Given that the virus probably started around late 2019, it's pretty hard not to.
Yeah. So, I mean, we probably missed the boat on that. But I think that the reason I bring this up is because I think it answers your question, that I think facing a virus that is much more lethal, it makes sense to have a more draconian response, and that your response should be proportional to the lethality of the virus. And that's what makes COVID so complicated, is that it's not lethal enough to warrant a totalitarian response, but it's also much more lethal than flu, which we have decided is something we're going to accept and we're going to have like a really weak response to. One of the bits I think that will come from COVID is that people won't go to work sick anymore, or that people will wear masks if they think they're sick, or they'll wear masks if they think they have the flu. Whereas in the past, you would just be like, suck it up, buttercup. You need to go to work and go infect your coworkers and your customers, and things like that.
Sneeze on each other.
We were kind of stupid about that. And like Asia, I think, Southeast Asia, which has had SARS and MERS, I think they've been wearing masks, with respiratory conditions for like 20 years. And so I think that maybe that's the direction we go. But ultimately, I'd love to see like more compassion towards our fellow man. And that's the argument, I think, for why people, want to get vaccinated is they think that they're helping the people around them, the people who are immunocompromised, who can't get it themselves, the elderly, the otherwise, people, the obese. It helps all these people who are at risk. And that's I think the best argument for why healthy people should get it. But to answer your question more explicitly, the line for me, China is clearly too far. I'm never going to defend anything that China is doing. I have to admit, I'm not as familiar with Austria or Germany's response. It sounds like it is, I'm sure it's not as extreme as China, but maybe it is more extreme than the UK and the US. I think the US has been somewhat reasonable, and the Supreme Court recently overturned the mandate for federal employees, or might it be all employees, that you can't tie your vaccination status to employment. Yes. So maybe history will say that that was a good call, but I do think that I'm curious how we react to something that's much more lethal, because that will happen eventually. We kind of got lucky. We ran decently with this particular virus as opposed to like a Spanish flu.
Yeah, no, and I'm open to lots of conversations based on another hypothetical situation, when it comes up. But for now,
well, we have to plan for the future.
We don't.
We're really bad at.
You and I don't have to do nothing. We could fuck off and live together on fucking.
Okay, I feel a responsibility, as an effective altruist, to care a lot about existential risk. I think it's one of the most important things we can care about.
I'm just being facetious, but
okay.
What I want to speak about is the now, and because what I really worry about is that I see this very tribal instinct for people on both sides of the argument to not give way for anything. And there are tons of people, and you included, that now I speak to you, I now know you're anti-mandates. I didn't know that. You'd never said that to me. You never made it publicly clear, at least from what I could see. Anti-mandates for the specific situation. And I now know that you're anti-China putting people in quarantine camps, but I didn't know that, because you hadn't made that clear to me.
Give me some credit, Charlie.
I'm just saying I didn't know. I would have bet that you were, but I hadn't. But the point is,
I understand.
You're right. Seen that publicly from you or from a lot of other people.
Yes.
And what I'm saying is, can we please look past the tribalism and say, this is what we agree on? The stuff that's happening in China and Austria, Australia, Canada, and Germany is too far. And we should, as an effective altruist or somebody that in charity and cares deeply about humans as in general, stand together and say, this is where the line is. And if you go past this, I'm going to protest. I'm going to say online what I think to you, no matter the social repercussions. And can we say that together? Like, will I see, I'm not expecting you to fucking chant all the same things that we're chanting on this side of the aisle. But will I at least see something that will say, I'm very pro-vaccine, but this is too far, and I will speak out against this vehemently until this is reversed. Because what I worry about is that we're being marched towards fascism, totalitarianism, and we're putting so much political power in the hands of people that you and I both know that we can't trust, and that we're allowing them to make the decisions of billions of people, or at least hundreds of millions of people across the world, based on whatever political or financial whim or incentive that they have. And to me, that is extraordinary. And I believe, and I know historians will look back at 2020, 2021, and however many years this goes on for generations to come. They'll look back on it and say, how on earth were so many people so silent as people's rights and freedoms were being encroached so dramatically? And I just want to know where the line is.
Yeah, I think it's I don't think there's a lot of countries that are on the wrong side of the line. I think China's clearly on the wrong side of it. I think adopting a zero COVID strategy is a losing proposition. So like that's Australia's goal. I think that's New Zealand's goal. I doubt any European country is trying to do that. However, the survey data I've seen is like the majority of Australians are supportive of the government's policies. So at least there's some buy-in there. I know that
much you can trust these surveys and polls, huh? But even if whatever, I'm not.
But the important distinction is that like we don't have survey data in China because surveying people is not something that they do there.
No.
So I think
they
that
shoot people that want to ask questions.
Absolutely, and I guess I don't share the same fear that you do, that we're on this steady march towards authoritarianism throughout the world. I think that
let's just take, so we can be specific here. Let's take, for instance, Austria. It is a crime now to not be vaccinated, even if you've had prior infection, even if you have a bunch of different reasons to not get vaccinated. It is a crime, and you have to pay.
There's no exceptions.
I imagine that there are some medical exemptions, but I'm not sure about that. I haven't looked into that.
Okay.
But for the vast majority of people, it's a crime to not be vaccinated, even if they've had prior infection. And that means that people are being fined and will be put into prison because they haven't had vaccination. That to me is totalitarianism. It's nonsensical, it's illogical, it isn't supported by data, it's pseudoscientific. And the government is overstepping and ripping apart families based on something that's so unnuanced, it's silly. Can we at least agree that that is way too far?
Yes, if it's as you described it, that there's there's no exceptions or very few exemptions. Like, it seems like that is clearly a step too far. I would not say. I mean, that would just be so. I don't think that would fly in the UK. It would certainly not fly in the US.
That's where we were heading. There were talks about it. There were discussions about it. It was part of the Overton window, and I mean, there was a lot of very scary stuff happening in the UK, and it's not off the table yet, I don't think. I think that there's too much discussion up in the air about things that are drastically inhumane being discussed like it's an acceptable point of view.
No, I think a country that we should be like modeling ourselves after, like I think a good response would be some of the countries that have had really low mortality from COVID. I think Israel had a great vaccine program. That, I mean,
what about like Nigeria?
So I don't know the state of vaccination in Africa. I've heard that like they're last in line to get vaccines.
Tiny. Well, but let's do a guessing game. Just I do have to go. So I'm very hungry.
Yeah, I understand. Anytime you need to leave.
There's 210 million people in Nigeria. They locked down at first, and then the government tried to lock them down second time rounds, and they're having none of it. They have a dual health care system. Sorry, my brain's getting a lot sludgier now. I'm gonna have to.
That's all right.
They have a dual healthcare system, public and private. So you can choose to get public or private, and they have access to things like ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine. 210 million people. How many people do you think have died worldwide from COVID throughout the whole pandemic in Nigeria?
In Nigeria, the whole pandemic, I'm going to say 5,000.
Yeah, it's 3,000. Yeah,
3,000. Okay.
Great guess. Most people, when I've asked this question on stream, have guessed in the tens of thousands, if not the hundreds of thousands.
Let's go.
Fucking
but I mean, I do think that the important thing to remember, and like maybe this is a point that should be emphasized a little more, and I've tried to do this in recent months, is there needs to be a conversation about how sick the US is relative to the rest of the world. We're an incredibly sick country. It's largely by our own making. I think that maybe, depending on who you talk to, there would be, this is a crisis of personal responsibility, or this is, to use your language, like this is a bunch of corrupt food companies that are peddling products that are bad for us. But regardless, one of these things needs to change, or both of these things needs to change. And so I think the US was a time bomb, or it was an explosive ready to be lit, because we're incredibly sick, we're vaccine hesitant, we're incredibly polarized in our politics, and it was a powder keg. If we were a healthier country, I mean, Nigeria is so much healthier than we are, and they're also more rural than we are, and they don't see this as a political thing. So, it's just, I do think that there needs to be a post-mortem within the U.S. And maybe other countries in Europe, but mostly the U.S., where our mortality is so much higher than any other countries. About how we butchered this and how we could do better. And I know that a lot of people who are opposed to the jab have made the excellent point that, like, we need to get healthier. We need to have, we have low vitamin D levels. We need to get our weight under control. We need to be more active. That's, that's the problem, is you can't do that in the short term. That's a long-term fix. So like the vaccine is what you do in the like that's the compression you put on the bullet wound, but eventually you have to extract the bullet.
I'm with you, brother. So just to kind of tail off here, I think that you will have extraordinary success grouping together good minds alike on both sides of the argument. If you can state, hello guys, I'm sorry that I've been a bit of an asshole. Fair enough, we all it happens to the best of us. I had to delete many tweets myself. Not recently.
Oh, you delete tweets?
Not recently.
Okay.
But
I
mean, like type something out and then
Oh yeah.
Before I
once I send it out, it is out. I'm not going to take it back.
Yeah. We'll get into Twitter etiquette another time. But recently, luckily, I've been able to be on top of my emotions. But anyway, if you say, "Hey guys, we have our differences of opinion. We disagree on the efficacy and safety of these vaccines, so that's okay. But here's the line in the sand. I'm willing to join arms with you and fight. And here's exactly what I think is wrong in the case of for COVID-19, the pandemic responses, the mandates, and things like that." I guarantee you'll see a huge amount of people that were otherwise angry at you, and they were being mean to you or violent to you or whatever people were doing to you because of these things, like verbally violent. I mean, if that's even a thing, then you'll see so many of them say, okay, we disagree on this, but as long as you're putting this line in the sand, we're on the same team. Because I know that for Kristen, I know for Alex, their worry is that we're going towards something so nefarious we can barely imagine it, and that's my worry too. Even if we're delusional in that, hypothetically, if we were delusional, if you can put us at ease and say, I'm against these levels of totalitarian measures, that would go such a long way.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And the funny thing is, like, while that may be in held in better favor by the people who are diametrically opposed to me, the funny thing is there's no free lunch, because you actually lose support from people who are like in your own camp.
That happens from speaking the truth, so yeah, and I know you believe
no
that.
And that's how I've always felt. I mean, a guy who I think is quite controversial himself, Matt Glantz, we've joked that we know we're doing something right when we piss off everybody. That I think that, like, being centrist, like, is a really good default or heuristic, that if you're in the middle on most things, then you're probably going to be right more often than not. When you put yourself on one extreme or the other is when you're going to be opening yourself up to be, like, wildly wrong about things or having massive blind spots.
So it's a conversation for another time with a lot of nuance. I'm getting particularly fatigued. This was a very good conversation. Let me just kind of tail off by saying, if anybody's angry at Andrew for his positions, or if anyone's angry at me, put it aside. It just isn't worth it. It's not going to do you any good. It's not going to do us any good. And even if I'm wrong, if he's wrong, if you're wrong, who cares, as long as we're fighting the same fight. And you've shown me to be the person that I didn't even hope you were, because I honestly thought you were a bit of an asshole when we were speaking on Twitter. But
I can't even say the same, because you conduct yourself so well, but I apologize that I gave you that impression. It's something I needed to reflect on.
Yeah, no, absolutely no worries, and nothing personal taken at all. I know it's a difficult thing to maneuver around, but I honestly, I would love to continue speaking to you.
Likewise.
I would love to do another podcast where we speak about something less stagnant than
I would love to talk about something other than COVID.
Yeah, imagine a world. And yeah, I hope that this conversation can reach a lot of people and potentially bring people together.
Yes.
I'm so exhausted. It was how long was that?
I don't know, but the time really flew.
3:48 to 6:13. So it's like two and a half hours. So I've just been speaking for almost 6 hours straight in front of the screen.
Go take a break.
Thank you, and I super appreciate it. I love you, brother. I really do. I feel a lot of affection for you right now, and it's probably got something to do with that ceremonial cacao I took earlier. But good on it.
Great talking with you, Charlie.
Peace, brother.